Well, I think the European Union is one of the most interesting things going on in history. This is a group of countries which, for generations, from the fall of the Roman Empire until 1945, used to go out and regularly slaughter each other on the battlefields of Europe. The idea was to create a structure where you could avoid that. You can still have your rows, but across a negotiating table or a debating chamber. And pooling sovereignty in a limited number of fields is essential to that. It's also a way of managing interdependence. Whether we like it or not, we are a group of highly interdependent countries, and we need a structure to manage that economic, environmental, and so on interdependence. Things that you 100 years ago could perfectly well do by yourself. Nowadays, there's a lot of things you can only do at international level or in Europe with a very high degree of interdependence at European level. So you have to work with your neighbouring countries. Now, traditional structures for doing that of international cooperation are not very effective, not very democratic, not very transparent. The EU tries to be a little bit better than that. People's identities and how they feel their sort of gut identity to be varies a lot from one person to another. And I think people have different dimensions to that. I, for instance, could say I'm English, I support England in football. I'm also British, I support Britain in the Olympic Games. And I'm European, I support Europe in the right to beat the Americans every 2 years in golf. This isn't contradictory, it's different dimensions. Now, some people will say the European dimension doesn't exist for them or is very small. Others will say it's very important for them. There will be different balances between regional, national, European identities. But I think what there tends to be overall, whether one feels it's part of your identity or not, there is an acceptance of the need to work together at European level. The European Union has created what is the world's largest single market. That's very important economically for all the countries in the European Union. But if you create a market at European level, you need common rules for that common market if it's going to work fairly and effectively. So we adopt at European level a lot of common legislation for our countries on consumer protection, on competition policy, on technical standards, on environmental standards, some aspects of workplace rights and health and safety at work, so as to create a level playing field, but also so that this market works fairly to the benefit of everybody in it. That's a large part of what the European Union in general and the European Parliament in particular does. Well, I've done different things in the European Union, but for 13 years I was an elected member of the European Parliament, where I was quite involved in reforming the structure of the European Union. I was what in our jargon is called the Parliament's rapporteur on what became the Treaty of Lisbon, reforming the whole structure of the EU. And I think it brought in quite a number of improvements, not least in terms of making the EU more transparent and more democratic than it had before. Strengthening the role of the European Parliament. You can't nowadays adopt any legislation, or hardly any legislation, at European level without the approval of the European Parliament. It used to be adopted just by ministers from the different countries, meeting behind closed doors. Not very transparent procedure. Now they have to meet in public when dealing with legislation, and it needs to be approved by the European Parliament as well. On top of that, before the ministers meet, their national parliaments have to receive the proposal so they can mandate their ministers. So that's made the whole thing, I think, a little bit more democratic than it was before, because there is an unavoidable problem of European institutions. They are more remote from people than national or local institutions, which is a good argument not to do things at European level if you don't need to. But since we do need to, and we do actually do some things at European level, it should be in as open and transparent and democratic and accountable a way as possible. Well, I think and trust it will continue. As you know, there's one particular country, I can't remember which one, which has a lively debate about whether it should remain in the European Union. I think it will. There is a long queue of countries that want to join, by the way. So in due course, it will end up being the structure that brings all European countries together. At the moment, it's 27. In 2 weeks, it will be 28 when Croatia joins. But in the end, it'll be a union of 30-odd countries. And what it will do in terms of its field of responsibility, will be broadly what it does now, the common rules for the common market, cooperation on transnational police and justice issues, fighting international criminality, terrorism, and so on. Working together on the environment. We are highly interdependent on the environment. Working together on things like I mentioned earlier, the Erasmus student exchange scheme. It won't take over other responsibilities, which will remain a national responsibility. Well, that's a very good example. I often hear Europeans, and I've experienced it myself, who've been outside of Europe. And for a start, other people treat you quite often as Europeans. They don't worry whether you're from Belgium, Luxembourg, Spain, whatever. And secondly, you notice it when you come back home, because although the European Union's motto is unity with diversity, we are a group of diverse countries and we're not trying to homogenize it. We do nonetheless have quite a lot of things in common. We are all countries with strong welfare states, for instance, relative equality compared to the inequalities in some other parts of the world, strong social security systems, strong education systems, and that differentiates us from many other parts of the world.